Racial injustice in the criminal justice system.
According to Merriam-Webster, injustice is defined as an absence of justice, which is the quality of being just, impartial, or fair, or the violation of right or of the rights of another, or an unjust act. Some examples of injustice in the criminal justice system include racial injustice, gender-based injustice, ethnic injustice, age-based injustice, sexual orientation-based injustice, and many others. Racial injustice or racial discrimination is defined as the unfair treatment or bias against someone or a group of people on the basis of their race. Racial injustice is seen within the U.S. criminal justice system in a various number of ways. There's been an increase in racial injustice in the criminal justice system over the past few years as African American and Hispanic individuals have been seen being targeted as criminals. There are many stories of African American and Hispanic individuals being wrongly accused of various crimes, and those have attracted a large amount of attention on social media and news sources, which perpetuates the issue and also elaborates the narrative of a racial disparity that is existing within the criminal justice system. And there are many different statistics that back up this disparity that is being created. This includes the fact that African American adults are 5.9 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites, and Hispanics are 3.1 times as likely. In addition, as of 2001, one of every 3 black boys born in that year could expect to go to prison in his lifetime, as could one of every 6 Latinos, which is compared to one of every 17 white boys. And lastly, in 2016, Black Americans comprised 27% of all individuals arrested in the United States, which is double their share of the total population. Michael Brown was an unarmed African American teenager who was shot and killed on August 9th, 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri by Darren Wilson, who was a white police officer. After news of the incident was released to the public, it was heavily suspected that the death was due to racial profiling. Many individuals did not feel that Officer Wilson's decision to shoot Michael multiple times in a lethal manner was warranted or necessary in any way. On this day, Michael Brown and Dorian Johnson visited a local liquor store in Ferguson where Michael was seen on security cameras stealing a version of cigarettes. The two left the liquor store and the theft was reported to the local police department. A little while later, Officer Wilson was patrolling and saw the two men walking down the middle of a street near the liquor store that had reported the theft. He approached them while remaining in his vehicle and asked them to move towards the sidewalk. They didn't want to do that, and there were like an exchange between the two men and the officer. The officer noticed that Michael fit the description of the individual who was suspected in the theft at the local liquor store. So he then contacted dispatch regarding the two men and pulled his police vehicle farther at an angle into the middle of the street, blocking the men where they were. After moving his vehicle, many witnesses report having seen an altercation taking place between Michael and Officer Wilson. There are many different versions of this altercation that were given by witnesses. Some claim that Michael leaned into the vehicle, attempting to punch the officer. Others report that no part of Michael's body entered the vehicle at any time. And when giving his testimony, Officer Wilson himself reported that he felt that Michael was reaching into the vehicle in an attempt to retrieve his gun, which clearly made him feel very threatened. Michael's DNA was found both outside the vehicle and inside the driver's door handle and on Officer Wilson's uniform on his left thigh. At this time, Officer Wilson fired his weapon twice at Michael while he was still at the window of the vehicle. One of these shots struck Michael's hand, at which time Michael began to run away from the vehicle, and Officer Wilson got out of his vehicle and began to follow him down the road. Michael stopped and turned towards the officer, who also stopped and fired his weapon 10 more times in the direction of Michael. 6 of these shots made contact with Michael, some of which struck the top of his face and head, indicating that he was bending at the waist at the time of these shots. And there were blood trails that showed that Michael had continued to walk towards Officer Wilson after initially being hit by some of the bullets. There is a very large array of different statements that were given by witnesses in regards to the actions taken by both Michael and Officer Wilson. These disputed whether or not Michael had raised his hands or not, and whether or not he had charged towards Officer Wilson. Some claimed that he had done these things, and others said that he had not, which obviously made the details of the situation rather complicated. Due to the differences in the statements that were given by these witnesses regarding the details of the encounter, the public began to protest the Ferguson Police Department as a whole and demand justice for Michael. After these protests and demands for justice, a St. Louis County grand jury trial began in order to determine if Officer Wilson needed to be indicted for a crime. The jury ended up not indicting Officer Wilson, meaning that there were not enough jurors who believed that there was enough probable cause that Officer Wilson had committed a crime to charge him. Following the decision of the grand jury to not indict Officer Wilson, the public erupted into chaos in response. Many individuals felt that justice had not been served and were very angry about that. Individuals began vandalizing businesses and property, lighting cars and buildings on fire, and looting local businesses. The public continued to demand answers, claiming that despite the grand jury's decision that this situation was a blatant example of racial profiling and that the Ferguson Police Department was corrupt. Many people accredited the decision of the grand jury to the fact that the jury was made up of 9 white individuals and only 3 African Americans, and given the fact that 9 jurors would have had to agree in order to indict Officer Wilson, and the social and racial climate of the area, many people felt that it was unlikely that multiple of the white jurors would have decided to go ahead and indict Officer Wilson, but rather believed his testimony that claimed that he saw Michael Brown as a threat and did what he had to do to protect himself. So after many weeks of protests, the Justice Department issued a scathing report which detailed the ways in which the Ferguson Police Department had violated the Constitution, which was in multiple ways. The report was very thorough and backed up claims that had been made by the public for many weeks that the Ferguson Police Department was in fact almost entirely corrupt. The report claimed that the only way that the police department could return itself to a law-abiding and just department would be to completely reformat its policing policies, retrain all of its employees, and evaluate the leaders of the department in detail. So following the report, the Chief of Police, Thomas Jackson, stepped down. Racial injustice occurred in this case when Officer Wilson fired multiple lethal shots towards Michael Brown. Despite the varying witness statements, Michael Brown was not threatening the life of Officer Wilson or anyone else that was at the scene. When Michael left the police vehicle and began to run away, he had already been injured by the first shot that Officer Wilson had fired, and by running away, he indicated that he was not intending to further harm Officer Wilson in any way. Even when Michael stopped and turned to face Officer Wilson after running, he was not close enough to him or in possession of any weapon that could cause harm to Officer Wilson. And this is the moment that Officer Wilson's own racial bias caused him to be unjust, as he fired multiple more shots towards Michael, and even as he began to collapse in on himself and fall to the ground, Officer Wilson continued firing. At this time, Officer Wilson was in no way protecting himself or anyone else, but rather causing unnecessary harm to Michael that was driven by an illegitimate racially based fear that his life was in danger.
The case of the Scottsboro Boys took place in Alabama in 1931. This is a case that's very familiar to schools. It was on March 25th of 1931 that 9 young African American boys were pulled off of a train and falsely accused of rape and eventually sentenced to death. This all began on a train from Chattanooga, Tennessee to Memphis. After boarding the train, there was an altercation between one of the black men and some white men on the train who continued to harass the boys. The 9 men found themselves being taken off the train afterwards and greeted by law enforcement who were accompanied by 2 young white women that were accusing them of rape. These boys had a 4-day trial with the representation of 2 lawyers who got the case that morning and did not have time to prepare for the case. The oldest 8 were sentenced to death, and the youngest was declared to have a mistrial, not because they found him innocent, but because they couldn't decide if they wanted to sentence him to death or to life in prison. This case, with the help of people in the community, was appealed to the state court, who upheld the county's decisions. On March 21st of 1932, the Alabama Supreme Court upheld these convictions with the sole exception of Eugene Williams due to his age. The case then went to the United States Supreme Court on October 10th of 1932, and they declared a mistrial because of inaccurate representation given to the 9 men. This did not find the defendants innocent, but just instead sent them back to Judge Hopkins for a retrial. They again were found guilty, and years later, um, it was after some had already died in prison, the state of Alabama ended up pardoning them for their crimes, seeing as they were falsely accused. The Brock Turner case is one that is widely known today. This was a case that happened on the Stanford University property, and this man was convicted of rape. The rape occurred on January 18th of 2015. In the court documents, it was stated that he did commit an act of sexual penetration, and the victim, Jane Doe, was unconscious of the nature of the act, and this was known by the defendant, the person committing the act and causing the act to be committed. The victim had been unconscious behind a dumpster when Brock Turner had assaulted her. In his statement to the court, he described his action as the product of culture of drinking, peer pressure, and sexual promiscuity. The statement by the defendant's father caused uproar when he said that his son's life had been ruined for 20 minutes of action. Brock Turner faced the potential of up to 14 years in prison. After a confession, physical evidence, and a complete case built against him, he was sentenced to only 6 months in jail and a lifetime of parole. He also must register as a sex offender for the rest of his life, and he found himself losing his swimming scholarship to Stanford. Out of his 6-month sentence, he had only served 3 months and was released on September 2nd of 2016. He was required afterwards to participate in a sex offender rehabilitation program, but that is all that he suffered. There is another recent case that takes place a little bit closer to home. This is the case of Albert Wilson. On September 10th of 2016, he was accused of raping a young woman in his apartment. On April 3rd of 2019, he was convicted of this crime. Albert Wilson was a former student at the University of Kansas and was sentenced to 12 years in prison and a lifetime of probation for this incident involving an underage student. When he was 20 years old, the woman was 17, and they met at a popular college spot and headed to the dance floor. At this time, Wilson and the girl had engaged in sexual contact while kissing. It was said that Wilson had invited the girl back to his place, which was near the bar, but at this time neither one had asked each other's ages. Security camera footage can, in fact, confirm that these two went back to his apartment together. Afterwards, the victim had claimed that Wilson took her back to his place and raped her, and while he admits in engaging in sexual acts, he said that the two had never had sexual intercourse. The KBI testified that Wilson's DNA was found on the girl. The hospital had taken swabs from her and found on her chest that there was DNA from Wilson's saliva from kissing her, but there was no DNA from semen fluid at all anywhere on her body. And it only took 6 hours of deliberation of an all-white jury to convict him of rape with no physical evidence and nothing but an allegation made by this woman. And he is still serving his 12 years in prison. There is clearly racial injustice in our system, and you can see it by comparing these two cases of Brock Turner and Albert Wilson. Although Brock Turner had a multitude of evidence against him, both physical and his own confession, he was served only 3 months out of a possible 14-year sentence. I believe that this was due to the fact that 1, he is white, and 2, he comes from a wealthy family in a good school. Then you look at Albert Wilson, and he is a black man who is sentenced by a white jury with no physical evidence, only a verbal allegation against him and footage of him walking with the woman, and he was sentenced to 12 years and lifetime probation. And that shows that there is very unfair treatment between white men and black men in the criminal justice system, especially with the fact that so much can happen only based on words, but Brock Turner got off with so much physical condemning evidence against him.
People have been asking for many years how we can rid the criminal justice system of racial injustice, and while there's no one right answer, there are a couple of options that we can try. This includes ensuring that police officers who are breaking protocol are held accountable in many ways more than just a simple disciplinary action, but are truly held accountable for their actions. This can also be done by implementing training programs that are more than just simple education on diversity, but are focused more on ensuring that officers are aware of how the public is going to view the police officers when they arrive to various scenes, and as well as how they should be treating each individual situation differently. And lastly, we can continue to implement various security measures such as body cameras and detailed reports that are given after incidents that could involve racial injustice to ensure that there are documents that can be looked back on later on when evaluating the cases. So these are just some of the things that we can attempt to do to rid our criminal justice system of racial injustice.